Welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly and I'm hosting today's event. We've long been admirers of Darryl Pinckney. Darryl's new book is Come Back in September, a literary education on West 67th Street, Manhattan. One of the first reviews here by James Campbell in the Literary Review called it a fascinating and original memoir. We're going to talk about this book and also touch on some of Darryl's other work, including Black Deutschland, a novel, and a recent collection, Busted in New York, and other essays. Darryl, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Before we get into Come Back in September, can I just ask you generally about cities? Because cities feature a lot in your work, and cities are very important to us in the work we do. How important are cities to you as a writer and also as a human being?
Well, it was because I'm from a place like Indianapolis, Indiana, which is, when I was growing up, a mid-sized city of very predictable character. You looked to Chicago or New York or Los Angeles for those things that you wanted to be interested in. And New York for me, especially because you didn't have to drive. And then the literature I read was all about these cities, and you wanted to be a part of them. When I was growing up, cities were very much the center of things, where things were going on. And we live in a much more decentralized culture now. But 50 years ago, it's a shock to think of it as 50 years ago, but it was. The city played a much bigger part in your creative and intellectual ambitions and aspirations.
I'll come back to cities later on when we talk about Black Deutschland, amongst others. Let's talk about the new book. Elizabeth Hardwick is at the heart of this book. Tell us a little bit about her and what made her a great writer.
Oh, well, what made her a great writer, there is this thing she used to say called the mystery of talent. So she certainly had that, but she also had an extraordinary sort of discipline and will, which is very hard to come by as a writer. It's very hard to tell yourself or to convince yourself that the world needs another this or another that. And who you are as a writer, or what kind of writer you are, after a while is sort of out of your hands. It falls to what you can do. And to live out your choices or lack of choices as a writer can be very hard. But she would always emphasize that this is the promise you made to yourself, that you don't know anything if you don't do the work. And so she, in one way, taught us how to take ourselves seriously without being pompous about it. She really minded arrogance, pompous people, any sort of artifice. She was rather a pure soul in that way, including acknowledging that, people are very mixed characters in themselves. So. Yeah.
And she wrote extensively in all forms, didn't she? She was an essayist, story writer, novelist.
Yes. And in her, they were forms of imaginative prose. I don't think the distinction between fiction and nonfiction interested her that much, because for her, sort of reading and writing about what she read and writing from her experience, or sort of reflecting on it in fiction, came from the same sort of sources, the same personality. They were just very different occasions. She had a very clear sense of sort of form, but she also had a very clear sense of what she wasn't interested in. And so it made what she did like to do all the more challenging.
You first encountered her in taking the class, didn't you? But then you went to work with her.
Something like that. I wonder if I even have it right in my memory or in the memoir, because I was using sort of burned pages where the thing that was gone were the dates. And I remember I asked Daphne Merkin, do you actually remember what year that class was? She said, no. Yes, but I remember these conversations, or the notes of these conversations were there. So they're in sort of the right order, I think. But I don't really emphasize in the memoir that much how much I think knowing Harriet first, sort of opened the door. Just parents are like that, so I was friends of people she knew already. So I was sort of familiar in that way. And then her cousin, who was at graduate school at the same time, was there. So I sometimes think, well, maybe I met her before I took her class. I'm not sure. But in any case, it did unfold like that. This sort of blunder and being taken in hand. And this was the 70s. And I'm sure there was another Black student in the class, a woman. And I think that at the time, professors, pay particular attention to that, wanted to make sure without being told, or that it was campus policy, that
You also
interested in your story.
you wanted to be a writer early, though, didn't you? And you took these classes, and then you went to do some work for her. I did, but always in a sort of fugitive way, since one of the threads of the memoir may be that to choose writing back then was like sort of electing to drop out because it was so uncertain. These days, it's less disturbing to parents as a career choice, but back then it seemed to be sort of throwing it all away, especially for Black parents who sort of grew up with this sense of duty and responsibility, that you didn't represent just yourself, that there was always something riding on it in the larger issue of Black America in relation to white society. So becoming a writer wasn't easy. And I think I came to it almost by default, of the failures that I was lining up. This one was the one that had interested me. But I will have to say that once I, showed myself in earnest, to try and sort of work, my parents, stood by me in that way. So in that way, I was lucky, and I was lucky in the professors I had, the people I met, and the friends I had. Everything conspired to help me. The problem I had was myself. But why do you say that? Well, it was also a very wild time. Yes. And I sometimes think that, maybe I shouldn't have gone to the Mud Club so often, but looking back, yes, one ran around a lot, but one also worked very hard, or tried to. It's just a lot of things. My first book, I wrote first as a kind of third-person family saga, and it was dreadful. But it took me years to arrive at this failure. I mean, years. And maybe I would have sooner had I not sort of, had it not been the drama of my life that I lived with then. Yes, I tried at first sort of reviewing, and then after Mr. Lowell died, I helped her with the first phase of gathering his papers and then hers. Work that Saskia Hamilton sort of finished.
And then I was very lucky also in that, I started publishing sort of reviews, first in the Village Voice and then in the New York Review very early. So, I had work as a writer, which is important when you're young, that, the validation of seeing your name in print and one thing leading to another, being able to project a future. These things matter.
Just continuing the story about Elizabeth Hardwick for a moment, you did all this work with her, and then then you've been very influential in making sure that her work has remained in print, come back into print, through the New York Review, New York books, for example, and you've almost kind of come full circle with it, haven't you? From early work with her right through to making sure this work continues to be printed and read now.
Well, it's certainly not me alone.
Sure.
One thing, Harriet Lowell has a lot to do with, being cooperative on projects and wanting to see this work available and survive. And the New York Review of Books itself, of course, is, very aware of its links to the work of Elizabeth Hardwick and her influence on it as a journal and on sort of the literary culture it's a part of and represents. And so this is Edwin Frank at New York Books, and Susan Barber, who worked on The Collected, and Alex, I'm going to forget his last name, not Tocqueville, but who edited The Uncollected, which is, a surprising volume and very, very interesting. So interest in her work is shared by many. And she had a lot of students who sort of remember her as a writer. Not, I don't think she liked to be thought of as a teacher, but I remember Sigrid Nunes said, I was very touched by this, that Elizabeth Hardwick was the first writer she ever met. And so she paid students the compliment of taking them seriously, and not sort of treating them as children. That's why she could be very severe and discouraging. But, she thought that was a part of what you had to be able to face was, well, this is terrible, or this doesn't work, or try it that way. And acknowledging that it's easy to do, well, not easy, you can do it for others, but it's harder to do it for yourself, because we're so invested in what we're working on that it takes a long time to admit that something's not right.
She was very honest about your poetry, wasn't she?
Yes, it was really, and unfortunately I found some of it. I thought it was all gone, and I found some of it, and so I haven't looked at it, but I also haven't thrown it away again. It's sort of this is a struggle with narcissism. There's no reason for this shit to be around, and yet it's like a photograph of yourself back then. Well, actually, those are easy to throw away too. So, I don't know. So yes, she was very clear about that. But then, at the time, I was very influenced by the New York School, and before that by a sort of Black militant free verse form. She didn't like any of that sort of thing. But I can think of a couple of lines in the memoir I wish I hadn't left in, because I can hear her say, well, those aren't true images, and they really bother me and worry me. And I'm waiting for someone to unkindly pick them out and say, well, this is stupid. And this is another thing. You can go on rewriting your work forever. At some point, you just let it go.
Yeah. You just to clarify a point for the listener and viewer, you mentioned earlier about the burnt pages. Were these the notes that were destroyed in your house fire?
Yes, I had a fire in 1977, and I'd been keeping a journal since 1971. and those rather burned up, except for the middle sections, which I put away in a box and stored in my parents' house and forgot about it for many, many years. And opening it up again is partly what, well, opened up a reason to sort of write this, as well as just sort of missing her and other voices, and wondering what they would say about things going on now. You sort of
You talked about the hard work, which does come across. It was also, there's a phenomenal amount of reading done in this book, isn't there? I mean, the amount of books you go through is just, you know, I think I read a lot, but I pale into insignificance really when I just read about what you read together or individually.
I know, and I think of myself, some of these people I met in those Oxford years, and the amount of reading they had done, you know, so there's always someone who leaves you far in the dust in any department. You know, you can have a conversation with people like Marina Warner or Jonathan Keats or Robin Lane Fox and just think, well, I've not read a thing. You know, so it's also in what areas you read. You know, I mostly talk about the things that she urged me to read or that were interesting to her. And it leaves out a lot of other things that were sort of going on at the time. And you sort of have to. But I hoped that or tried to keep in mind her idea about character and personality and the intellectual life, and that reading is very intimate and tells you a lot about the person. And so I wanted to write about a woman writer from the perspective of her mind, not just the other things that go with the biography of being a woman writer. I think that's why I keep emphasizing Margaret Fuller, and you know, as this early translator of Conversations with Eckermann, that this Black woman was also reading at the time. You know, that there is this history of women as intellectuals in a way. So I was interested in that, and also remembering the 70s, women's writing was a kind of an avant-garde literature to me at the time, and certainly took the place of a lot of things that were going on in Black writing that didn't entirely speak to me, because you know, that kind of the spectrum in feminism in some ways was similar to the spectrum in Black culture, you know, from something very militant to something, you know, the militants didn't think of much transformative value. And so watching it played out there helped me to think about how I felt things sort of on the other side. And then at the time, you know, a kind of gay literature, you know, sort of deliberately gay literature was emerging, or openly gay literature was emerging. So New York was very exciting, just on the page, never mind everything going on in art and music.
I wanted to, that was what I wanted to come on to next, but just before that, I mean, there's many other writers, artists, filmmakers mentioned in the book, most of whom I'm glad to say I've read or seen their films, but you talk about Mary McCarthy, Hannah Arendt, Susan Sontag, Fran Lebowitz, some of them, Angela Carter, some of them are now dead, sadly, some still around, Margot Jefferson, Vivian Gornick. You know, we've had some of these people speak in Bristol, actually, and Angela Carter has a strong Bristol connection where she did some of her early work in the city. But when you read about those names and what you discussed and so on, and when you talked earlier about when you know, this was a more important time for these kind of things, you do get the sense that we've lost a world here. I mean, is that true, do you think, both in terms of intellectual, in terms of the importance of the writer in society? Do you think that's true, or am I looking back on this with kind of rose-tinted glasses?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I can't tell what's changed. I can't separate what's changed in society from not having been this age before in my own life. And then there's the pandemic, which has done another thing to the sort of before and after sense of life largely lived. I don't want to fall into the position of immediately suspecting or dismissing change as something for the worse. Though I have to say much of what is going on troubles me and is a reflection in ways we don't understand of what is going on politically and economically, you know, the sort of fear and sense of sort of impending crisis. When I think about how these were sort of very, you know, our drama about doom seems very romantic and spoiled to me in retrospect. You know, the idea that the Reagan eras were some kind of Weimar conclusion. This seems really silly, but, you know, we were in our 20s then. I don't know if I'm being clear. So it's hard for me to know, you know, change comes anyway. And so is it just because it's change or because it's change for something that I think is the wrong direction? Certainly the threats to democracy is very, very new for me, very real. And this is a shock. But also kind of stridency in the culture, you know, or that the mainstream has been swamped by such kind of, I don't know, extremes, I find also discouraging in a way. So, yeah, I suppose I'm meandering a bit because it's hard to answer the question.
Yeah, I mean,
but
it is.
You know, the liberal culture that that flourished in our time was never a majority culture. You know, the mainstream was very different. Liberalism has been really demonized. But what I think of as liberal culture never really got a chance, or was a very sort of spotty patchwork kind of thing. What people resent about it is the prestige of liberal ideas and the influence that they continue to have. And then for it to become something else in the name of progressive movement, I find, you know, not so happy making. I don't like censorship in any form. You know, free speech is sort of living with views that you don't agree with or don't even respect. The problem is, of course, now there's license to sort of, you know, things have gone beyond free speech issues into something else, which is propaganda, and it's rather difficult to, you know, to know what to do or to think as the assumptions behind, I don't know, some kind of social consensus weaken, and the consensus sort of weakens and something falls apart. That's a long way of saying, I don't know, just cut out. I'm sorry.
No, but I do think, I mean, these are questions we have as well about the future of democracy and the way things are going in this country, for example, at the moment. And this country is a very troubled country at the moment politically, given what the recent change in the Prime Minister and the challenges, let's say, the new Prime Minister has faced, often of their own making, I must say. So these are issues which concern us. Well, I suppose what I was thinking about was when I look back at, say, early 70s America, and things like Watergate and the way that Congress dealt with that is very different to how they might have dealt with it these days, or certainly the Republican side would have dealt with it.
Well, the Republican side of it doesn't want to deal with it at all, or has sided with him for very short-sighted reasons that have long-term consequences of damage. If I don't run it, then I don't want it.
Yeah.
Or it's not worth anything if everyone gets to benefit from it. So all these sort of terrible feelings come from an underlying sense of the world's resources are not infinite after all, and that there's not enough. The thing that's very changed on our side is that there used to be a global sense of solidarity and movement, and that's sort of not around anymore. I think that the global has become something we're not entirely sure we want anymore. Yes, it's a rather sort of, we're becoming like those Eastern states we used to feel sorry for, that the state and the society didn't have much to do with each other. And here we are kind of that way again, only in this case, we're on the side of the state. We kind of want the state to survive because, it's a sort of protection against these other forces that, want to sort of bring it down for every bad reason.
Coming back to the book, we
all rant like we're in pubs. So.
Sorry, I missed that.
Nothing. Go on.
No, that was really important, and I think it's really important to discuss these things. And we're very keen to have the views of writers and artists and poets in all of our work on these really difficult challenges that we face. In the book, there was a big challenge at the end, as you come to the end of your book, which is the AIDS crisis, and how part of the book is about all the people that you lost. But this was just before it became the major crisis that it was. You talk about being the last summer before before you could believe in the virus.
Yes. Well, that's why I think the book stops in 1981. And then there's just this epilogue in 1989 of being somewhere else and people dying that year for some reason. Because, after 1981, things turned rather dark in these sort of downtown precincts. It went with a kind of increase or change of atmosphere in the drug culture. And yes, the last time Lucy saw Basquiat in '83, he had no teeth, and things were really, so I wanted to sort of remember a time of promise and hope, because it meant so much to me. I think one of the biggest differences is that the young then lived with a much larger sense of possibilities than the young do now. And, as desperately loved as many of these young people have been, they can't help but sort of resent the older generation for, leaving them this inattention to climate in the name of living sort of well. At the same time, my generation has always thought of itself as the one that sort of opened the doors and did this and that. So to be sort of written off or dismissed, or to have these things declared of, limited value, or that the sell date has gone by, is a real shock. Again, I keep using the word shock because, the confrontation with print every day, it can be rough.
Mm.
But no one ever promised one an easy life.
The impression I get is it was a happy time, though, for you. It was, the work you were doing, the relationships you had, being in New York itself.
Yes, looking back. So I filtered out in this version everything in these old journals that, is really embarrassing. Because I think, I guess youth can't help but be a time of anxiety, as well as, this kind of freedom, especially in New York, if you've come from a very kind of careful bound world that I did. So yeah.
One of the throughout the book, once you start to work with them, is your work with the New York Review of Books, and I've been a subscriber to that journal for at least 30 years, I would say, and I do think that journal and others such as Partisan Review you mentioned in your book shouldn't be underestimated in terms of contributing to this liberal culture, this feeling of of an intellectual life. What did it do for you as a writer, being involved with the New York Review of Books?
Well, it gave me a home. It gave me a voice, and it gave me don't like to use the word community because it's overused, but it gave me, yes, friends, old and young, and it put me close to people, writers I revered, and so literary culture was a vivid and real place, and it was always interesting and exciting, and yes, it sort of said that a lot that goes with writing can be worth it. So I was fortunate in that way. Maybe if I hadn't sort of been so concentrated on reviews and the essay form, I would have had or found more confidence in fiction. I don't sort of think so. At the time, what mattered to me most was because it coincided with this renewed interest in the Harlem Renaissance. I was learning a lot about something that I lived with, but actually didn't know that much about. These names had always been in the house, but I didn't really know that much about them, which was the case of a lot in sort of Black history for me. They just, this just was part of the atmosphere of growing up, but, I was running away from home and it included that. So in a way, this sent me sort of back home in through an odd door, that one would not have expected.
And are you talking about people like Claude McKay and people like that?
Yes, well, Claude McKay.
Claude McKay, I apologize.
Yes, everyone in my family always knew the poem "If We Must Die," but they certainly didn't know his story. But they knew a lot about Langston Hughes because he, had been a figure of their youth. And Sterling Brown was a relation, and so the Black world, especially the Black world of Black literature and Black education, were very close at the time because a lot of these Black writers taught at Black colleges when my parents were students, or my grandparents knew them. So this was always in the air, but it was something that I think that's why the New York poets and things like that spoke to me with such force, is because what could be more unlike, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a contemporary, but actually a lot of Black poetry. Well, Frank O'Hara was cosmopolitan and urban and going to the coffee shop and all that kind of stuff I wanted to do. he wasn't sort of in the protest tradition. So it represented a sort of different freedom for me, if that makes any sense.
In the book, you talk about the two
New York was
remarkable.
full of choices then. That's what I mean.
Sorry, I missed that.
New York was full of choices then. You didn't have to be one thing. You could have a lot.
And I think that comes across in the book very strongly. The two people who you talk about a lot in the book are Barbara Epstein and Robert Silvers, who I regard as towering people of our time for the work they did on the New York Review of Books. And you talk about at one point in the book, talking about hard work, how you got a letter from Bob Silvers one day, a 3-page letter with, I think, comments on a piece you'd written, which must have taken him a long time to write, and also must have taken you a long time to write before he sent the letter and to work on afterwards. But phenomenal amount of work. Yes.
And imagine that he'd probably done it for 20 people that day.
Yeah.
So, they certainly worked. They really did. Both Bob and Barbara, they really invested their lives in this around the clock. And I think that in some ways the standard of the work and who the contributors were entirely reflects people's confidence in them and respect for them. Yes, but it was a sort of different culture at the time, and the New York Review was a very kind of fragile organization as a business. A lot of these things were. That was partly their independence, and also everything was always sort of, at risk.
Yeah.
So, it gave a certain tension to what they were doing, and it had to be worth it, not just for them, but, what they said that they would give their readers. Also, it may have been one of the first publications that, in that format, in that newspaper format, where the articles went from start to finish without breaking up.
Yeah.
And that was part of also at the time, something they had in common with the New Yorker, that you could write at length.
Yeah.
And people used to sort of make fun of New York Review essays as being all about what the contributor thought. And then he gets to the book, or she gets to the book in the last paragraph, something like that. But, you had these kind of minds or that they trusted on these subjects. Some people really, after a while, complain that, they don't use anybody else. But then again, it's very hard to write in this way. It's not academic, and at the same time, it's not, anyway, it takes something. But also, I think what James Fenton said when he's, as a journalist and an essayist, what has mattered most to him was having an editor who wanted you to succeed.
Yeah.
And that, I think, matters a great deal. That, the editor who talks you into it, the editor who, takes care for what you're saying and stuff like that. Nothing can replace that.
It's still the journal I look forward most to receiving, and the first one I read on the pile that arrives each week, or in the case of the New York Review of Books, fortnight. I mean, there's just recently I've read some fantastic essays. There was one recently by Hermione Lee on Joseph Roth, for example, that based on a new biography. But it did lead to one of the time in the book where Elizabeth Hardwick, looking at the amount of work you put in, worked out that you get paid about 2 cents an hour, I think.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that was always the joke, but you got to write these things at length, and often they became books.
Yeah.
In that way.
Yeah.
Certainly for Susan Sontag, this is true. On photography, Mrs. Metaphor.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the book, you're moving to Berlin, and then, of course, you write about Berlin in your novel Black Deutschland. One of the people that influenced you in this is one of our favourite writers about cities, and that's Christopher Isherwood.
Yeah. Yes. Well, you know, I came down with the Isherwood bug very early. The Berlin stories and Cabaret, you know, met me at the same time, and that was the end of it, you know. So, and in a way, I sort of never got over it. Yes, and then you sort of, you know, the literature of the time, not just Berlin, Alexanderplatz, in the early 80s, these translations of Doblin's really bizarre novels like Carl and Rosa and November 1918. This was all really fascinating for me, including Joseph Roth at the time. Yes, and I started going to Berlin through the 80s. The novelists set a little earlier in order to get in a certain event, which I wasn't there for. And so I think looking back, the characters are much more blasé about Chernobyl than that people actually were. You know, I've forgotten the fear people had of radiation poison. Anyway, yes, and I sort of, you know, skip over it in the memoir, but it is a very post-rehab sort of decision, you know. So I moved to Berlin, and I was very lucky that while there, I met again Robert Wilson, who asked me to do some work for him, helping Heiner Müller, and so it gave me a way to stay in Berlin. So I owe Robert Wilson a great debt.
And how did you find, I mean, one of the reasons some people move to cities is they find a more tolerant place to be if you're black and gay. Did you find that in Berlin more than you found in New York?
Probably. Well, you don't want to say you hoped you were exotic enough to interest people who, you know, weren't so interested back home. That could have been in there, I'm sure. But it was mostly that this sort of walled, unreal city and the culture that was going on in that city. Berlin had only had no politicians and no businessmen. It just had students and artists and intellectuals and old people. Students because you were exempt from national service if you lived in Berlin, and old people because you didn't have to pay taxes. So it was a very subsidized place of really big city culture without big city problems. It was such a kind of theater of you know, of free living, but at the expense of all of this unfreedom around you, because it's in the middle of the Iron Curtain, not on the edge, right in the middle of it. So, but yes, you know, Berlin was a very fascinating place at the time, and for a long time, the Lower East Side and West Berlin had a real sort of link of, you know, people coming back and forth.
In the final few minutes I've got, I wanted to ask you about James Baldwin. He's someone else, a bit like Elizabeth Hardwick, who his reputation is strong. I mean, he did go through a period when people didn't really read him, but he's strong again. You write about Baldwin in the book, and also you were asked by the New York Times around 8 years ago to say if there was one book that made you what you are today, it was the Notes of a Native Son. And there's a wonderful essay in Busted, your collection, about Baldwin. What attracts you to him, and why do you think he has come back with such force now?
Well, of course, you know, at the time, he was the only Black gay writer I knew. And also, it was the writing itself about very subjects very much in the air and on one's mind. But he wasn't a sociologist like Kenneth Clark. And he also wasn't political. in that sense of, being, he had no Marxist past, unlike Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison. So he comes to us from that generation more influenced by psychiatry and psychology and sort of Freud and different ideas than anything social economic. He used to be knocked for not having any economic analysis, that his approach was always moralistic or individualistic, but this turned out to be a very important thing to imagine, to speak to Black people as a group of individuals, not as a mass. That was something I think he was able to do, but I think it was mostly the writing itself, just this astonishing style and striving to sort of be real, moment to sort of moment, at least in the, things I most admire. He, great writer, not everything has to be great. But certainly, it mattered a lot to me because, that were some things that you felt left you out at the time, that, you weren't being included. Now that Black institutions and things like that are celebrated as being important for their pioneering or, for the forebears, at the time they were really, in the 70s, they were mocked as imitations of white society, or middle-class Black life was, really kind of derided for, supposedly its values or turning away from the struggle, none of which was true. And so, somehow Baldwin's voice included you in the story sort of as well, made you a part of it. Now, I certainly couldn't follow him on the Panthers, but the Panthers were so fashionable back then.
Yeah.
They sort of said anything except my father, who really minded that, because, he thought that was rather, thought any kind of public nihilism was very self-destructive, because what else are terrified white people going to do? He thought that was really of limited value. But he only came from a world of Black guys standing up, so he didn't really have any sympathy for macho postures. As far as he and his friends were concerned, they'd never not had this kind of posture of defiance, because they succeeded in spite of the obstacles, or in spite of white society. So they weren't sympathetic to separatism or to militancy. They didn't think any of that was real. And Baldwin went through this phase of being so afraid of not being a part of it. But no, that's not right. I think he was so angry that no matter what they said about him, he wasn't going to desert them. I think it's more that he was really angry with the society for the violence and the broken promises. He's a very eloquent and heartbreaking figure, and I think it's his openness that helps us to find him not as a contemporary figure, but as a relevant figure.
And I think that relevance is why he has come back. Certainly, it was helped by Raoul Peck's film, which we showed.
A wonderful film. Yeah.
Quite a lot in Bristol. And then since then, I know people who have read the work, some for the first time, some not having read him for a long time, and have discovered something new, whether they were reading it for the first time or indeed rereading it. One thing I was going to ask you is Baldwin had no Bristol connection, but we're looking to do quite a lot of work on him for the centenary of his birth in 2024. And do you have any thoughts on what people who want to mark that centenary, what they should aim to do that year, what they'd hope to achieve?
Well, certainly, you know, the Raoul Peck film goes a long way to reproducing or capturing how captivating his voice was. There's a lot on the Buckley-Baldwin debate, but I think nothing approaches the film itself. You know, the sort of plays made out of these historical figures strike me as slightly exploitative as well as well meant, but nothing touches the film itself. What's so amusing about the Peck is that there's no Buckley in it whatsoever. So watching the whole thing, you know, that's another thing. I mean, I think all sorts of documentary footage about him is interesting because he was such a mess, you know, and because they're films in which he really misbehaves. He's like Nina Simone. He will really misbehave and things like that. You know, people are already doing what a writer would want, which is to keep reading him, you know, in that way. Carol Phillips said that, who knew Baldwin, said, well, he would love all this. And you mentioned James Campbell earlier, and he's, you know, one of these early biographers of Baldwin, but more than that, he's always sort of been his champion and was his editor at a time when Baldwin wasn't as sought after as he had been, you know, so he stood by him as well. It's just a shock to realize that it's 100 years coming up.
It is.
How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, the years catch up. They go quickly, don't they? One book I've been rereading a lot and trying to craft something around is the one you write about most in your essay, which is The Devil Finds Work, and about his views on cinema and film culture and racism within the film industry. And the problem is to do that seriously, I think you'd have to show some of these films, and some of them are, you know, ones you might not want to watch these days, but maybe
it could make you pick others that were sort of more worth it. I remember I didn't like that book when it came out, but you know, I didn't like Lady Sings the Blues, so I didn't understand what he was doing, and it's sort of acquired more value to me as time goes by. The Peck draws largely, the Raoul Peck draws largely on this. Yes, you know, there are a lot of Sidney Poitier films you could watch for James Baldwin, and the Malcolm X question. You know, there are many cinema opportunities, and you know, he had I think his taste was more for blues than for jazz, really. I'm not sure about that, but you know, it will all sort of be done, I'm sure. No one's going to let it go by. But the main thing is to read and you know, now that everything is back, you can sort of read with some critical distance, you know, because you know his fiction is, you know, a different order of thing from the essays, you know.
Two quick final questions, though they're both big subjects, but the first is, you contributed to the 1619 project, which has been controversial and incredibly valuable. We were planning, inspired by that project, we were planning a similar project in Bristol, because Bristol has its own areas of contested history, and particularly controversy over its you know, trading enslaved people and so on. What are your reflections a bit further on now from that, on that project?
The mayor of Bristol arrived at the right solution, and to display, I forget his name,
Edward Colston.
Yes, that guy.
Yeah. In
that manner, fine. I think they should put the Black Lives Girl back up. You know, I forget the guy who put up the Black Lives Matter young woman project. I think they should put her up on the same plinth, you know, because it's all sort of part of the same story. Once you start in Poor England, nothing is without some offensive connotation. So you know, I'm not in favor of monument removal monument renaming. I don't mind Churchill in Parliament Square. You know, none of these things. I don't want anything to happen to the library at All Souls. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. You know, you add to things, you don't have to sort of take them away. And I think that the National Trust deserves some credit for, in many places, going out of its way to make clear the association of certain places with certain kinds of trade. And, you know, but all of 18th century London, you know, is a sort of slave trade, sugar trade, architecture. So, you know, all you can do is understand that. I wouldn't want to, you just have to look at Dublin to see what happens when you start tearing down Georgian architecture. Yeah. You don't want it to happen. So, you know, this is the history of the world, this beauty alongside, you know, terrible human cost. And that's not going to change. What changes is what we know about it and how we think about it, and you know, without becoming sort of destructive ourselves. As for the 1619 project, of course, it's sort of on two issues. You say 1619 project and it's just a political slogan. Yeah. So it's sort of these people to keep you out of the curriculum. And this is just the segregation culture of the United States. History is a neighborhood and I don't want you to move into it. You know, history is a neighborhood and you can only move into it if you know how to behave. So, you know, all of that I simply reject as, you know, this kind of impoverishment of public education. What's behind that is an attack on public education, especially the idea that there is a kind of general curriculum that you want your citizens to have been exposed to because it makes them better citizens. So I don't think any of that is useful. As for the book itself, I was very interested, but of course I don't agree with everything in it. Sure. I don't think the Revolutionary War was fought to defend slavery. I don't think that's true at all. So
I think Bristol is going through this reckoning now, and there's lots of interesting things happening educationally. And we did want to do a similar project to the 1619 project, but the pandemic stopped us raising money and all sorts of other issues. I just reminded myself, actually, the Black Power salute was Jen Reed, yes, and the artist is Mark Quinn, the sculptor rather is Mark Quinn.
Yes. I couldn't remember the names, and I sort of included them in electoral monuments, but I can't remember anything. I blame the pandemic, but it's probably the pop.
Don't worry. The final question is coming back to Elizabeth Hardwick, because she wrote a lot about New York, wonderful material about New York, which is available. 2 days ago, I thought, well, I'll reread some of Elizabeth Hardwick, which I must say I haven't done for a long time, prompted by your book. And I picked up Sleepless Nights, which is just a terrific book, I think. It's rightly regarded, I think, as an important book. What if someone's coming to Elizabeth Hardwick for the first time? What would you recommend? How should they start?
Well, Sleepless Nights.
Yeah.
Because it's short, you think you can just sort of breeze through it, but it's not. You know, she really does control how you have to sort of take it in, because it's not casual. Just because it's short doesn't mean that it's casual. It's very carefully put together so that you're not aware of how it's put together. Yeah. You know, it has this sort of flow and voice. And like many great books, they become works of history as time goes by. Think how much sort of history there seems to be in The Great Gatsby, though people are debating now its worth as a novel, which surprised me. But about Dreiser, you wouldn't say the same thing. And so I think that she had her commie past survives in this radical eye, who she looks at on the street, who she's interested in. You know, it's the sort of people who, in some ways, she feels some kinship with, and sort of outsiders, oddballs, eccentrics, discarded women, people slightly vulnerable, losers, you know, everyone the city used to protect, and that the city doesn't quite anymore. You know, in her landscape of her youth, of these hotels where you can sort of live I really miss those.
Yeah.
You know, I'd move into them in a second.
And we shouldn't forget, just in conclusion, that Elizabeth Hardwick had a piece in the very first New York Review of Books.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, as one of the founders, she did. And I think she had two pieces. One was on Robert Frost, and the other was Grub Street, New York.
Yeah.
You know, what is this place? And she was always interested in New York as this place of refuge for interesting minds and people who wanted to be around interesting people.
Well, it was a quote from Grub Street essay that I wanted to conclude with, where she says, "Making a living is nothing. The great difficulty is making a point, making a difference with words." And Darryl Pinckney, you've done this for us, just as Elizabeth did. You've made a difference with words. Do read Darryl's work. We encourage you to do so. Both Busted in New York and other essays, and Come Back in September, are published here by River Run Books. As I mentioned, I also reread Sleepless Nights recently and recommend that too. In fact, recommend all her work. Thank you, Darryl, for joining us today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me and for your very kind words.